African unions and employees have taken to the streets in Johannesburg with concerns over pay and service delivery. I'm now joined by Nicholas Preston, a director in Cliff Decker Hofmeyer's employment practice, to talk about the prominence in employee strikes this year and what measures companies should take when engaging disputes such as these. Nicholas, thanks so much for your time. I mean, right now, I think the biggest strike everyone is talking about is that of Eskom and its workers. Do you have a view on that in terms of what Eskom or employers should have done to have averted such a long standoff?
Yeah, I think the difficulty with the Eskom strike is that they operate in an essential service. Because they're part of power generation, generally what would happen in the Eskom scenario is that they should go through an interest arbitration, which is what some international countries have done in order to resolve their disputes. It would seem that, and there have been efforts to go that route, but it would seem that there hasn't been a resolution. I think the tough economic climate that the country currently finds itself in is also plaguing the issue in trying to resolve the wage gap between what the parties are expecting in terms of an increase and what Eskom can really afford.
I mean, many would say that their initial stance to come out and offer absolutely no increase at all was their biggest mistake, particularly if you've seen what they've done recently. Around 3 offers now, we're at 6.2%. So I'm wondering, I mean, does that communicate to workers that if they went from 0 to 6, I mean, I might actually get the 9 that I'm looking for?
Look, I think there's always a power play between parties in a strike, and at the end of the day, it's who can hold out the longest. I think the reality and the difficulty for South Africans is that as an economy, we sit on the sidelines waiting for the dispute to be resolved. And at the end of the day, even if demands are given into and there's a higher increase that's settled, it may result or have a knock-on effect further down the line where you may see retrenchments and those costs trying to be recovered elsewhere. So it is a power play, but it's a very sensitive topic, especially in the Eskom environment.
And in terms of strike season broadly, there was a time a couple of years ago when, you know, it was a big thing. It was every other day, you know, you'd find some form of protest in various sectors. And I feel it's kind of calmed down since then, but what are you seeing on the ground, particularly with the clients that you represent?
So there's been quite a few wage negotiations this year. In fact, one of the industries are busy going through their wage negotiation at the moment. Quite interestingly...
Which industry is this?
Road freight is busy. They started their negotiations on Monday, so that would be effectively in the transport sector. And years gone by, you would have seen the moment the parties deadlocked or there was a dispute, the parties would resort to industrial action, there would be strikes, there would be lockouts, people would take to the streets. This year, especially in the chemical sector, we saw a deadlock, and that deadlock prevailed for a number of weeks, where parties continued sitting at the table and came back a number of times in order to try and resolve things. And my sense of it is that that's just a sign of the times at the moment. There are still labour disputes, there are still wage demands on the table, but parties are holding out longer than what they used to, and I think it's just a sign of the economic times currently.
I mean, you highlighted that with Eskom, those are essential services, and I do know that there's sort of parameters that they can have in terms of embarking on a strike, which is not necessarily the case for other companies or other sectors. You're talking about the possibility of unprotected strikes becoming a real threat for employers. What informs this view?
I think the difficulty is that because there's so much pressure on the ground, and when I say on the ground, I'm talking about at the coalface in the workplace, and because of economic times being so difficult at the moment, because we've had 2 or 3 years of big retrenchments being seen in various industries, I think there's a heightened pressure. And there is a procedure to be followed in order to engage in strike action. There is union rivalry that's going on. There's new unions, there's unions that are disappearing, and workforces are changing. So it is a volatile situation that we are seeing on the ground where you do have unprotected strikes from time to time. And I think the difficulty in South Africa is that, and it's a reality that all accept, strikes today are met with violence and intimidation. People are fighting for their livelihoods at the end of the day and in order to retain and improve their lives. So it's something that parties are resorting to more and more often, and unfortunately when it's unprotected, their job security is placed at risk.
All right, so is that meaning that employers naturally need to invest more in security in events like that?
So that's one of the aspects. I think communication is one of the biggest aspects between employers and trade unions or organised labour. I don't think that there's enough communication between parties. Yes, there are wage negotiations, but there is an element of distrust in those just because of the nature of the discussions that happen. But I think very often you find that when a strike commences, the employer pulls back to their camp and the employees pull back to theirs, and there's no longer any communication. And I think that's really where things become protracted, and like in the platinum industry where you saw extended periods of strike action. So communication is one big aspect that I think employers need to look to put in place. The other aspect is to get rules of engagement. So picketing rules, it's open to parties to agree on picketing rules up front in their recognition or relationship agreements. Alternatively, the CCMA is there to put that in place so that there is some sort of accord and harmony where a strike is embarked on, that there's rules of engagement and you don't have chaos.
Well, Nicholas, we will leave it there. Thanks so much for your insights. That was Nicholas Preston, a director in Cliff Decker Hofmeier's employment practice. Stay tuned for more Power Lunch after the